Ever feel like you're trying to decode some ancient hieroglyphics when you read about those big economic agreements countries sign? Tons of technical jargon, lots of promises, but at the end of the day, do you uh, really get what's actually at stake?
It can be overwhelming, for sure.
Well, in today's deep dive, we're going to grab a document that's been causing quite a stir in Argentina, the 2025 agreement with the International Monetary Fund, the IMF.
Right. We've got excerpts here from the Acuerdo FMI 2025 gurampe.pdf that translates roughly to the IMF Agreement 2025 that breaks things. Our job today is kind of surgical.
Surgical. Okay.
Yeah, we're going to dissect this text so you can see the core arguments, where the potential hidden problems might lie, and most importantly, how this could potentially affect you directly. We'll focus on whether the Constitution was respected, if there are clauses that could be harmful, and the broader consequences this deal might have.
Okay, sounds good. So let's start with what probably caught a lot of people's attention right away.
Yeah.
Was this agreement signed, following the rules of the Constitution?
That's absolutely a crucial starting point. One of the main criticisms you see coming out of the analysis is that the executive branch signed this without getting prior approval from Congress.
Right.
Now, the National Constitution, Article 75, specifically Sections 4 and 7, gives Congress the power to manage the payment of national debt and to approve new loans.
Okay.
So the big question becomes, shouldn't an agreement of this scale, which clearly impacts foreign debt, have gone through debate and a vote by our representatives?
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, if we're talking about the country's debt, shouldn't the people's voice through their legislators be heard on it?
Exactly. And it actually goes a bit deeper. The agreement is structured as an extended fund facility, or EFF.
EFF, right.
The issue there is that it wasn't treated like an international treaty, which does require congressional ratification. By structuring it this way, some argue they bypassed that legislative step.
Kind of like a loophole.
That's how many interpret it, yeah. A way to sidestep the Republican checks and balances, that fundamental idea that the different branches of government need to keep each other in check.
The analysis also mentions the infamous letters of intent and technical memorandums. It kind of sounds like there might be side deals happening, doesn't it?
That's the concern. Historically, these kinds of instruments have often been used to agree on conditions with the IMF without needing legislative approval. They act like shortcuts, They avoid public debate but end up shaping the country's economic policy without going through the proper institutional channels.
So right here, we're starting to see how Congress's power might be getting chipped away, aren't we?
Correct. Implementing this agreement and the policies it pushes for seems to impact Congress's functions in three key areas. First, its power over the budget.
The power of the purse.
Exactly. The Constitution clearly states Congress approves the national budget. But this agreement imposes really strict fiscal targets and, crucially, requires IMF approval for certain types of spending. This limits Congress's ability to decide where state resources go based on, society's priorities.
And those automatic adjustment clauses. I remember reading about those.
Yeah.
Sounds like Congress loses even more control over the economy then.
Spot on. If the agreed-upon fiscal targets aren't met, these clauses trigger automatically. Things like tariff hikes, devaluing the currency, spending cuts.
Without a vote or debate.
That's the point. It means Congress loses the ability to decide how to manage public spending in critical moments. That decision effectively shifts to the executive branch and ultimately is conditioned by the IMF agreement. Plus, the deal pushes for reforms in taxes and revenue sharing between the nation and provinces, areas where Congress is supposed to have the final say.
Okay, so budget is one area. You said three. What's the second way Congress's power is affected? Is it about making laws?
Yes, it's legislative authority. Congress is responsible for creating and changing laws. But this agreement promotes a whole slate of pretty deep structural reforms, labor, pensions, trade, among others, that alter existing legislation. And often, these reforms are pushed forward without the necessary debate in Parliament. We've seen a heavy reliance on necessity and urgency decrees, the famous DNUs.
Right, the emergency decrees.
Yeah. While the Constitution allows them in exceptional circumstances, here they seem to be used more frequently, arguably as a way to avoid legislative discussion.
And that's where things like the lay bases and RIGI come into play, right?
Yeah.
They seem like key tools for pushing these reforms without needing specific congressional approval for every step.
Exactly. The lay bases the omnibus bill and RIGI, the incentive regime for large investments, grant broad economic powers to the executive branch. This allows for privatizing state-owned companies and managing natural resources, often without the central role Congress should constitutionally have.
Okay, so budget power, lawmaking power, what's the third leg? Political oversight.
Yeah.
Congress is supposed to watch over the executive branch. How is that weakened?
Well, the IMF's influence over economic policy inevitably reduces Congress's capacity to effectively oversee the executive. Many significant decisions are made within the framework of this agreement, kind of shielded from parliamentary scrutiny.
Because they're tied to the IMF deal?
Partly, yes. And the lack of transparency often surrounding negotiations with the IMF makes this oversight task even harder. Congress might not have all the information needed to evaluate the policies being implemented. It could even limit the feasibility of initiating impeachment proceedings if key decisions are perceived as being driven externally rather than solely by internal democratic processes.
All of this really seems to point towards what the analysis calls an unconstitutional delegation of power. This sounds like a very serious concern.
It's definitely a central point. Those automatic adjustment clauses are a prime example. By predetermining that if certain targets aren't met, the government must automatically apply specific austerity measures. It arguably strips the executive branch of its political decision-making power over the economy in those moments. That decision gets shifted to a preset mechanism dictated by the IMF agreement.
But wait, some of those measures, like changing taxes or utility tariffs,
Yeah.
aren't those clearly things Congress is supposed to decide?
Exactly. That's where you see this hidden or disguised delegation of legislative power. By setting up automatic adjustments in these areas, the executive ends up implementing measures that constitutionally fall under Congress's jurisdiction without needing specific legislative approval at that moment.
It also messes with government accountability, doesn't it? I mean, if the measures just happen automatically, who do people hold responsible?
Precisely. It dilutes the government's political responsibility to the people's representatives. The adjustments occur automatically, so the government doesn't necessarily have to take the direct political heat or answer to Congress for those specific triggered decisions in the same way.
And ultimately,
Ultimately, the argument goes, this undermines popular sovereignty because it conditions economic policy on externally set targets, limiting the ability of the people, through their elected representatives, to determine their own economic future.
this whole picture seems to really challenge the separation of powers. How does the agreement manifest that specifically?
Well, the agreement essentially lays out a comprehensive government plan. It covers monetary policy, fiscal policy, structural reforms, privatizations, the works.
So it's not just about the loan amount.
Not at all. It's like the IMF is deeply involved in designing public policy across the board, but without the popular deliberation and checks and balances you'd normally expect. This feels like a transfer of functional sovereignty, which clashes with Article 1 of the Constitution, the part that establishes Argentina as a representative, Republican, and federal government. The Republican form relies heavily on that separation and balance of powers.
And what about the federal part? In a federal country like Argentina, how does this impact the province's autonomy?
The centralized implementation by the executive branch of these IMF-agreed policies tends to sideline provincial autonomy, which is guaranteed by Article 5 of the Constitution. Furthermore, the analysis mentions potential restrictions on the rights of indigenous peoples and provinces regarding their natural resources, especially under frameworks like res vi and the lay bases.
It even suggests the judiciary could be affected by this agreement. How so?
That's right. The pressure for fiscal adjustment can lead to budget cuts for the judiciary, potentially impacting its ability to function independently and safeguard citizens' rights.
Less resources, slower justice.
Potentially, yes. There might also be indirect pressure for judicial decisions to align with, or at least not obstruct, the adjustment policies. And paradoxically, cuts to social rights could actually lead to more lawsuits, putting even greater strain on the judicial system.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. The document also highlights legal traps, ambiguities, and harmful clauses. It sounds like the language used is deliberately tricky.
Exactly. It's just the technical language acts like a smokescreen, hiding the real consequences. You hear terms like flexibilization, fiscal discipline, or state modernization. They sound neutral, maybe even positive, right?
Yeah, modernization sounds good.
But in practice, the analysis argues these often translate into layoffs, severe austerity, selling off public companies, and cutting back on rights. They deliberately avoid more direct terms like privatization or layoffs, perhaps, to avoid immediate negative public reaction.
Sneaky. And we're back to those automatic adjustment clauses, but looking at them more from the perspective of their practical impact on people's lives.
Correct. The analysis emphasizes how this logic of semi-annual review with financial sanction creates constant external dependence. The state loses the freedom to set policies based on social well-being because it's constantly tied to meeting externally imposed targets.
What are some concrete examples they give?
Oh, things like automatic hikes in utility tariffs, devaluation of the currency, cuts in public spending, measures that directly hit everyone's wallets and living standards.
Okay. The third major point analyzed is the surrender of common goods and strategic resources. Here, the focus seems to be squarely on the lebases and rigii.
Yes, the argument presented is that these legal frameworks basically institutionalize a giveaway. Rigii, for instance, reportedly offers huge benefits to foreign investors. Things like a 30-year tax holiday.
30 years, wow.
Yeah, no requirement to reinvest profits locally, freedom to send foreign currency abroad, and international legal protection against the Argentine state itself.
So critics see this
As foreignization and losing control over fundamental resources, lithium, oil, copper, water, biodiversity, without generating real national value added, like industrial jobs or sovereign decision-making power over those resources.
and there's also the mention of selling off state-owned enterprises.
Right. The IMF recommends selling state companies, often under the guise of rationalization or efficiency. The big concern raised is the lack of clauses to protect essential public services, ensure territorial integration isn't harmed, or maintain social accessibility.
So things like ensuring remote areas still get mail service or flights.
Exactly, or that energy remains affordable. And there's also criticism about the lack of consultation with provinces that often co-own or have jurisdiction over these resources and companies.
All of this, inevitably, leads to harsh social consequences. The document uses terms like poverty, inequality, and precariousness.
The fiscal adjustment being implemented is described essentially as shock therapy. They point to the sharp drop in primary public spending in 2024, around 30% year on year.
That's huge. Where are the cuts hitting?
Cuts to pensions, public sector salaries, subsidies for transport and energy, and key areas like health and education. The analysis frames this not as achieving fiscal order, but as deliberately creating a minimal state for the poor while maximizing benefits for markets.
So celebrating a fiscal surplus
While potentially causing deliberate impoverishment, that's the critique.
and the erosion of social rights seems like a direct consequence of these policies.
Absolutely. The proposed pension reform, for example, increasing the retirement age, reducing the real value of benefits, is seen as violating the principle of non-regression in human rights, meaning rights shouldn't be rolled back.
And what about jobs?
Well, the expectation outlined is that mass layoffs and the promotion of precarious work will increase informality and exclusion. This disproportionately impacts already vulnerable groups, women, young people, indigenous communities, informal workers.
The issue of financial conditionality and odious debt is another core point in this analysis, isn't it?
Yes, the sheer size of the agreed loan, around USD 20 billion, nearly 5% of GDP, is significant. And the fact that disbursements, the actual handing over of the money, are tied to passing these regular reviews.
It creates ongoing external supervision.
Exactly, constant external tutelage. Furthermore, a point raised strongly is that a large chunk of this loan is apparently being used just to pay interest on previous debts without generating new investment or tangible benefits for the population.
Which brings up the controversial concept of
Odious debt. Under international doctrine, this refers to debt incurred by a regime without benefiting the people and without their consent. The analysis suggests parts of Argentina's debt might fit this description.
Finally, the document delves into the geopolitical consequences, linking the agreement to what it calls subordination to the Atlantic axis.
The argument here is that this agreement solidifies the IMF's role almost as a shadow government, aligning Argentina's policies primarily with the interests of, say, Washington, London, and Brussels.
And moving away from other potential partner.
Right. It suggests that this dependence on the IMF, coupled with a rejection of closer ties with powers like China, Russia, or the BRICS bloc, represents a kind of regressive geopolitical shift. It potentially isolates Argentina from South-South integration projects.
How does that connect to resources?
Well, the critique is that promoting the privatization of strategic resources like lithium and energy is geared towards exporting them mainly to the US and Europe, rather than prioritizing regional integration or domestic industrial development using those resources.
Okay, wow. After digging through all that detail, several core themes really stand out, don't they? the potential constitutional conflicts, the loss of sovereignty in various ways, the very real social costs, and this shift in Argentina's global positioning.
Exactly. The arguments keep circling back to this transfer of power away from democratically elected bodies towards external institutions or mechanisms. The use of ambiguous language to push through deep reforms presented as mere technical necessities is another recurring theme.
And the implications for controlling natural resources and setting independent economic and social policies are huge.
Definitely. And, crucially, the direct impact on ordinary Argentinians through austerity measures and the erosion of social safety nets, plus the long-term consequences of this kind of financial dependence and geopolitical realignment.
You mentioned the odious debt idea again, and the possibility of an audit.
Yes, the analysis briefly touches on an audit as a potential step to investigate the legitimacy of parts of the debt. It also notes that this agreement could potentially override or conflict with existing national laws and even international treaties Argentina is part of.
So wrapping up this deep dive, the question that really lingers is, well, it's a big one. What does it truly mean for a nation's future when its economic policy and its sovereignty become so deeply entangled with international financial institutions? It's certainly something to think about seriously.
It's a fundamental question, and we really invite you, the listener, to reflect on it. This analysis we've discussed is just one perspective, a starting point based on this particular document. We encourage you to research further, seek out different viewpoints, and form your own informed opinion on this agreement, which clearly has such significant consequences for Argentina.
Thanks for listening to Geopolitica, a podcast by Enrique Arrilli. Don't forget, support us financially and spread the word about our work. Until next time.